network security, and we're going to try to get about 2 hours that we talked about at the bar last night collapsed down to less than 50 minutes. So please bear with us. We'll be going through some of the material kind of quickly, and we'll try to take questions at the end. If you have a question in between, we'll certainly take that, but if we're short on time, we might just move forward to make sure we get through everything. So our panelists here, go back. Chris Weisapel from Veracode, and we've got Steve Christie from MITRE Corporation, Bob Martin, also from MITRE, H.D. Moore, Rapid7, John Klein, Broadridge Financial Solutions, and Kelly Todd, representing OSVDB. So these are basically the life cycle areas we want to get through. If you saw Marianne Davidson's keynote this morning, she talked about secure development life cycle, and in a perfect world, we wouldn't even be talking about vulnerability management because everybody would be doing all of that and it would all work perfectly and there'd never be a vulnerability, and anybody who believes that, right. So these are what we see as the basic stages and life cycle of vulnerability management. Back in the 80s, I was a system administrator at Bell Labs. We ran a program called COPS, which was very controversial at the time. It was a hacking tool. And what COPS really did was just looked at some basic configuration and file permission stuff. It didn't have a database of plugins like sophisticated scanners do now. And scanning is great, but it's only one part of the whole thing. If you think that's managing your vulnerabilities, you're missing a huge part of it. So what we're going to try to do is talk about the different phases: vulnerability discovering, private vulnerability sharing, public disclosure, vulnerability database management, which our friends from MITRE and OSVDB talk about, vulnerability monitoring and testing, and remediation. So, sorry if I'm talking fast, we have a lot to get through. Everybody on this panel has a really broad range of experience, but for the sake of having a decent discussion, we're kind of pigeonholing people into different roles so that they can talk about that particular aspect of it. Jonathan Klein is a senior vice president at Broadridge Financial Solutions. He's got the headache of trying to manage vulnerability for a large organization. So he's going to be representing our end user organization and managers. But before that, John was a consultant, so he's had lots of different experience in this area. Bob Martin with MITRE is also going to be talking about end user organizations, but also tool vendors dealing with some of the vulnerability information that comes along. We have Chris Weisapel talking about the application developers and application research point of view, since that's where his focus is right now. And I'm sorry, I can't see because of that. HD from the zero-day perspective from vulnerability researchers. Steve Christie with the fire hose of what they deal with at MITRE. And Kelly Todd, who's got the perspective of trying to manage the open source vulnerability database. For vulnerability discovery, at this point, vulnerability discovery is going to be involving people from the end user organization, the vulnerability researchers, and the application researchers. So I'm going to start with John. In your organization, you'd be doing monitoring for anomalies and various things to see what's different. So
yeah, I mean, I spend a lot. Well, my group spends time, trolling through the various news groups, whatever the vendors send out to us. We've been engaging vendors who deal with threat modeling and actually, start looking at anomalies so we can get ahead of the curve. It's a pretty big job of trying to keep track of all the different vulnerabilities because we run on very diverse platforms, anything from open systems like Windows and Unix all the way up to mainframes. So big challenge, a lot of expense.
And sometimes an organization like that will bring in somebody like Chris, who would be specifically looking at their homegrown applications. And what are some of the challenges you've seen in this area?
Yeah, so one of the things in Veracode, where I work, is also a software company itself. So we have to deal with eating our own dog food and managing our own software we're creating. And if you're building software, you also have to think about monitoring the sources of code that you're coming from. No one writes software from scratch. People use libraries, people use frameworks, people use third-party components in there. So one of the things we have to do is monitor if there's any vulnerabilities in third-party libraries that we shipped in our product or are planning on putting into our product. So we have to think about it from that perspective and think about testing the code that we're taking in. So we're doing a little bit of vulnerability discovery ourselves. This is part of our part of our development process. And of course, from a SDLC perspective, you want to discover the vulnerabilities as you're hopefully building the code.
Okay. And HD, with the Metasploit framework, I'm sure you have a few things to say on this subject.
Sure. A lot of folks talk about how testing engineering networks can be somewhat of a challenge because engineers tend to be set in their ways about what they do. Rapid7 is a huge engineering base, huge engineering pool, and because of that, as a CSO, I have to come through and make sure our audits are done properly, our bugs are actually fixed, all that. We take a little bit different approach than a lot of organizations in that my view on things is if it crashes when I'm testing it, it should have been patched. So we take a much more violent approach to vuln testing than I think a lot of organizations do or can get away with. So my view is a little bit skewed on that. Generally, when we start doing internal audits on the Rapid7 network, we start just hitting every exploit against every target, and if something falls over, we go patch it. So it's a different approach to vulnerability management and vulnerability assessment, and it makes sure that everything that we have internally is rock solid, or we find out about it much quicker. So the problem with vulnerability management solutions in general is you tend to have a lot of false positives when you don't have authentication on the targets, and the problem with exploits is they tend to be somewhat destructive and tend to take things out. So we're still trying to find the right balance internally for the right way to do that type of testing, and externally, of course, we also provide nice, secure, reliable, automated, safe vuln testing.
Okay, now once a vulnerability is discovered, HD, I'll propose to you too. For your typical vulnerability researcher, not necessarily you or your company, but your typical vulnerability researcher generally finds something and is often posting to security lists, or where do you see them their first actions with that sort of thing?
The beginning of kind of the vulnerability life cycle is what I find the most interesting. A lot of times, the Metasploit development team, for example, is working on bugs between 24 hours and 48 hours before anyone else really sees them or cares about them. Generally what happens is we hear reports about 0-day, we try to find the sample in the wild, we reproduce in the lab, we get an exploit out, and we move on to the vulnerability management and vulnerability testing side. In terms of how researchers approach this problem, I think a lot of folks generally have an intent to work with the vendor. It's only when the vendors burn them so many times that they decided just to start posting stuff to the mailing list. I know Kelly could probably go into more detail about the stats, the numbers he's seeing in terms of how that split plays out in the real world, but I think we're seeing a bigger trend towards full disclosure now than we have before.
The next one. So, and often you'll have, before it gets posted to lists, you'll have some private vulnerability sharing, some of the underground lists, and often this will generate additional research because you might have a guy who found something, little exploit in some piece of code, he posted to a list, but somebody who's got a little bit more experience, or better hacker or whatever, will do additional research based on that and could find an expanded impact to that particular vulnerability. And often we've got 0-day exploits that are out there for a couple of years. Often people wonder, like, well, why are you worried about not having services that you don't need? There's no vulnerability known for it. Well, not that we know necessarily, and that's why you need to protect on things like that. Steve, you had a comment on, oops, I broke the internet, so.
Yeah, if you find a vulnerability that's something along the lines of, finding a fundamental protocol flaw or a cryptographic algorithm issue, or any kind of design level problem in a very popular network protocol or file format or something along those lines, someone who finds it may not be thinking in terms of the large scale impact that they might have. They might just be thinking about, oh, I found this little problem in this one product. But then you wind up getting entire classes of products, dozens, hundreds of vendors that all wind up being affected. And if it's an individual researcher who's the one who's found this, they don't have the knowledge or the expertise to really get it fixed entirely. And that's where the classic organizations such as CERT really can come into play, and that's where some of their big strengths are. However, as you might imagine, doing all of that kind of coordination can take a long amount of time. You'll have some vendors that may be all set and they're ready to fix something right away, and then other vendors that still need 6 months. But meantime, that vulnerability is known to some non-zero set of people And the "oops, I broke the internet," that was basically Dan Kaminsky's reaction to the DNS issues that he had found, right? And that took that was circulated privately for I forget how long, 7 weeks or something like that. There were a lot of people who knew about it. There were certainly rumors flying around. And then it was, basically independently replicated once the rumors got loud enough. But nonetheless, that's one thing that needs to be accounted for, is that a lot of these vulnerabilities may be known for months, if not years, before they wind up getting disclosed. Even within CVE, because of our unique role of assigning these identifiers that people use, people will come to us ahead of time. They've discovered a vulnerability, ask us for a CVE identifier or 2 or 3, and then we'll give it to them. And that CVE identifier may go unused and unpublished for years. We have one from 2009 that I covered just yesterday in my fire hose talk. But we have hundreds of those, dating back to probably 2001 and 2002. So that's definitely one important consideration, is that there are a lot of vulnerabilities that are out there that are not public, but are known and at risk one way or another of being independently discovered.
I think one of the other aspects we were talking about last night was people not understanding the impact of the 0-day they have. Old example is the Morris worm that went out, and there's probably a lot of others as well, where the researcher might think, oh, I'm just testing this, it's a small impact, and all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose.
Yeah, I'll use, I don't remember any specific examples, but it's happened fairly frequently, and Microsoft has kind of mentioned this publicly a number of times. A researcher might go and find a vulnerability that seems to be in an Internet Explorer or something like that. Maybe even develop an exploit, or at least give some indication that this could be a really bad kind of problem. All right, so it's bad enough that maybe it's an Internet Explorer, but Microsoft, being the vendor of the software, digs deeper, and this could apply to any vendor, and then suddenly find out, oh no, this is actually in a library that we run that affects all of the software that we use, because all of our software runs this library. In the very early stages, you generally will not have full knowledge of what the implications are of the problem.
Carole, I just wanted to add something.
Sure.
One of the things that drives private vulnerability sharing is, solving security is not a one organization problem. It spans organizations, so there's value to private sharing in those cases. And you can see Microsoft has a case, for instance, where they will give information to the AV vendors and the IDS vendors prior to coming out with their release on Patch Tuesday, so they can start working on detection techniques. So there's a case where it's shared to a private, it's shared privately because it's a multiple organizations are trying to solve the same problem. It's all not just the single vendor. We have a case of this at Veracode too. I've started getting vulnerability information from some of my customers, where they will get a report of a vulnerability in one of their products, and we're scanning their product statically, looking for defects. And what happens is, oftentimes, if someone finds one class of vulnerability in one of their products, and once that goes public, all of a sudden the researchers go and they start looking for that vulnerability across the whole product line. And so there's a lot of value to doing static analysis, honing in on that one class of issue and making sure it's not across your whole product line. And this is another example of sharing, because multiple organizations are trying to solve the same problem, so you have to have some private vulnerability sharing.
This could start a whole rabbit hole discussion, but does anybody have any thoughts on the companies that purchase vulnerabilities purchase 0 days and then share it with their subscription list? Nobody wants to touch that, huh?
Sure.
HD had a comment.
So specifically, there's basically 3 types of vulnerability buyers out there. You've got the folks like ZDI and iDefense that buy it primarily to provide products for their customers, either vulnerability reports in the case of iDefense, or in the case of ZDI, signatures for the filtering product. Those products, those services, those companies really don't pay very much. they pay much more than they used to, about 10 times more than they used to just 5 or 6 years ago, because of the competition from the other two buyers. The other two buyers are, one is primarily government, primarily large contractors who are selling multi-million-dollar contracts to other agencies or working on projects that are, somewhat secretive. A lot of times those companies are U.S. agencies who are actually operating outside the U.S. and buying vulnerabilities from European researchers. So it's kind of an interesting model how that works. And of course the last case are all of your shady black hats who are doing drive-by downloads, that type of exploitation. For every offer I've seen from kind of the shady government folks, I get about 5 or 6 from the shady black hat folks, and I'm not sure which one I'd prefer not to work with more. So it's there's very few options available for a legitimate researcher trying to publish the research and get paid for the process. So I'm happy that ZDI and iDefense exist, but I do wish there's more options available for researchers to get paid for their work.
Yeah, researchers seem to get beat up a lot of times. I think everyone in the software industry makes money off of the software, except for the researchers, who generally seem to be expected to do all this work for free. And at this point, with software getting a lot, at least certain kinds of software getting a lot more secure, the amount of effort that needs to go into finding an issue and then proving an exploit and so on can go on the order of months. And so I'm comfortable with programs like, I'm personally comfortable with programs like ZDI and Tipping Point because they do work with the vendors. However, there are other programs that do not, they may learn about new exploits, new vulnerabilities, and not share that information with the vendors. And that, to me, coming from a sort of purist white hat, let's have the whole internet protected, I think that's a potentially dangerous route. But it does exist, and largely because of the need for compensation for researchers.
So Carole, one of the other things is that, all this information, the vendors, when they do get the knowledge of it and they start working out the patches, they actually have information that not only can they inform IDS and malware virus protection type tools, but they could also describe in a machine understandable way how to tell if you had this vulnerability when their alert goes out. And so if they did that, then all their customers wouldn't have to wait for their vulnerability management tools to rev, but rather they could ingest. And of course, we offer up the OVAL language as a way of expressing how to check so that immediately customers could check and know the impact. So, getting CVEs, getting CVSS scores, doing OVAL, that's just a way of making it much quicker for people to know about what is going to be the impact of these things to them.
We need to move on to the public disclosure because we could spend time on this for an entire session. So once the public's been disclosed about the vulnerability, there might be an article out in various media. There's various reactions to that. You need to have the coordination between the vendor and the researcher, which is, I think, a little bit about what you guys were just talking about. And need to determine what to disclose to the public. You don't want to start a panic. I've seen lots of cases where might be a security company that's trying to make a name for themselves, repackaged or found a repackage of a vulnerability that's 5 years old, calls it a new name, gets it out to the press, and people panic over this new virus when it's really, oh, we had this before, it's just changed the name. Nothing new. So any thoughts on the media disclosure and how the public reacts to some of these? Actually, John, you are the one who ends up dealing with this because you have your boss saying, are we vulnerable? I just read this in my paper.
Yeah, I usually get from some senior executive some article they found on some vulnerability that we've already dealt with, a couple of months or maybe 6 months, a year ago, and have to respond back saying, yes, we're aware of it, we're dealing with it, or we have dealt with it. But there's usually a firestorm of emails that go back and forth until the issue kind of dies down.
Kelly?
And speaking a little more to that, yesterday we had a little bit of a conversation about FUD versus reverse FUD, where the same media articles that John might get might overblow an issue by a factor of 10 or a factor of 100. But at the same time, you might have the reverse in that as well, where something that is a little more serious might not get the same media coverage. It's really weighing it, and the truth always sort of lies somewhere in the middle. It may not be as bad as it looks, but it's probably not going to be as downplayed as some might take it. So it's weighing in a lot of different factors.
to add into that. I mean, there's two things I have to look at. There's the actual technical vulnerability, and then there's the real business risk. And so when I look at some of these vulnerabilities that have been disclosed in the media, I have to really weigh it against what's the real risk to the business. And something that may be blown out saying, oh, this is horrible, could be very little risk to the business, and something that could be underwhelmingly reported could be a great risk to the business. So it's not just looking at the technical vulnerability, but understanding how it really is going to impact you. And I don't think it's a science to that. I think it's more like an art. You really have to look at a lot of factors and really try to make sure you understand your business.
I'll add on the vulnerability, on the CVE vulnerability database side of things, more on the coordination side of things. I'm not sure what percentage of issues are disclosed where both the researcher and the vendor have coordinated. It's fairly good, actually, probably 30% or more. But the quality of information rapidly declines if you have only one of those parties disclosing issues. Many vendors, either intentionally or unintentionally, don't release certain critical details that may be useful for defenders to build IDS signatures or vulnerability scanning checks or things like that. On the flip side, if researchers go find issues, don't coordinate with the vendors before they make announcements, well, one of the key problems there is that the patch isn't necessarily available, but their perspective is also limited. They may not have a full understanding of, for example, all of the affected versions, all of the affected product lines, and so on. And so there's a challenge where the quality of the information coming out is going to vary widely, but not all information is available either, even after the point of disclosure. So you can wind up having new information coming in on a fairly regular basis. And that gets challenging for us on the database side to maintain and monitor. And I can imagine, John, on the customer side that you're often dealing, are you missing this information when new updates come out, or do you have to go in and more or less waste time to go and look for these updates? How do you manage that?
Well, sometimes we do get the updates. Sometimes I have to go fishing for additional information. Most of the vendors we deal with are pretty good at reporting to us any of the issues, but some vendors not so good. It's going to vary.
I think you also have to realize where you're getting your information from, and in John's situation where you've got upper management is reading media articles, if you're using that to get your information about vulnerabilities instead of from your vendors, it's kind of like getting your antivirus information from your yoga instructor who sent you a chain letter. Not very reliable. So move on. So this is kind of the fun that OSVDB and MITRE has to deal with of vulnerability database management, and I'll let you guys you start on that, Steve, because we had a long discussion about this yesterday. Sum up your talk in 5 minutes.
Some of the talk. Well, we monitor a number of different sources, bug track, mailing list. Those of us in this vulnerability database industry, we also all monitor each other as well, which makes for some entertaining or not so entertaining issues when somebody somewhere makes a mistake and the exact same mistake is replicated across 5 other databases, which is always a little embarrassing. But it also gives you a notion of how much sort of sharing occurs. Each database has basically a different set of references or sources that they monitor, whether they pick it up by subscribing to lots of different email lists. In the case of CVE, we do it almost entirely by web scraping. I know OSVDB, Brian Martin seems to have a penchant for going and looking at really sort of obscure locations that no one else monitors and yet picking up a whole bunch of vulnerabilities there. One of the big challenges, though, in managing this is that you have many different sources that are all reporting the same thing, but they might not be reporting the exact same thing quite the same way. So you often wind up with an apples to apples question. Am I really looking at the same, these two vulnerability reports? Am I really looking at the same vulnerability or not? As an end consumer of these vulnerability databases, you might not necessarily have to think about that too much. Hopefully, if it's something critical, it's got a CVE in it, and so if the CVE numbers are different, it's reasonably safe to assume that, okay, they're probably different, and we have to maintain and do a mea culpa when duplicates do come out. And there's a lot of different factors involved in that. But it's a full-time job for multiple people to monitor all of these different reference sources and to sift through them and understand what's going on and figure out if things are important enough or not. In the case of CVE, we average about 7 or 8 references per CVE identifier. And each reference could represent anywhere from 2 minutes to 20 minutes of analysis. So even just the process of adding a reference is a big labor-saving device for the consumers of this information. But which sources you look at also directly impacts what vulnerabilities wind up being disclosed. And that's one of the benefits, I think, of this sort of almost incestuous relationship between all the different vulnerability databases where we all watch each other is at least the cream of the crop still kind of floats to the surface and not a whole lot gets missed.
Actually, Steve, we were talking a little bit yesterday about how you have to summarize some of these vulnerabilities, and I find I manage technical content, and the challenge lots of times is to be dealing with engineers and technical people and trying to take their information and turn it into something understandable content. So,
yeah, I mean, a disclosure could be as short as a product name and a single URL, demonstration URL exploit, or it could be a fully functioning 300-line multi-stage exploit where the researcher might have given a label of, buffer overflow, but if you actually go and you look and you read the exploit, you're actually leveraging 3 or 4 different pieces, separate vulnerabilities. There are language problems. Terminology is not necessarily particularly good, or at least varies widely. The people who disclose issues are not necessarily, there are all different kinds of motivations, and some people who disclose issues are not necessarily disclosing them so that people can fix those issues. And so certain critical bits of information may be missing or may wind up being inconsistent between different sources. And so CVE and the other databases have to put in quite a bit of work in order to even just summarize these things in a way that's going to be useful to the end users, generally sysadmins or security professionals, so that they can understand what the issue is without bogging them down in too many details. But you have to sift through the details to even get to that point of being able to do the summaries.
Carole, did you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, to go to Steve's point, he did bring up that trying to monitor a whole bunch of different reference points can get quite tedious at times. From an OSVDB standpoint, of course, we reference CB, and I feel like we have a good working relationship with them. There's a lot of different other types of sources that we're looking at, though, too. Not just news articles, but as Steve mentioned, Jericho goes out and does fresh meat change log entries, and some of these can go into the dozens and dozens of pages across multiple versions, just to pull out details for 1 or 2 vulnerabilities in a really obscure software package can literally take a couple of hours per vulnerability.
Then there was this whole voting machine kick.
Yeah, the voting machine. Steve had the confidentiality, integrity, availability, and democracy risk, for voting machine descriptions. But really, part of it too is knowing your target audience. You have to look at your system engineers, your system administrators, your security analysts, and what are each of them looking for? From a security analyst standpoint, I might be looking for what is the specific fix, patch, upgrade, or solution to a particular problem. That might be my primary focus, where from a system administrator perspective, you might want to know specifically which versions were affected and where the information is to download all the patches to get them ready for deployment into a production system. Sort of going back to what Steve said too about the workflow and the overload. You'll get a lot of researchers who will go across specific types of software packages, and they'll find one thing in one package and then go looking for similar packages and try to find the same vulnerability across those. In his Firehose talk yesterday, he mentioned ROT, and ROT was doing one specific exploit, cross-site scripting or SQL injection across one software package. And then he figured, well, I can go out to SourceForge and I can download a dozen other software packages, and I bet they have the same thing. So now, instead of just one vulnerability in one software package, you have to look at the same type across multiple software packages, and it gets to be fairly time-consuming to So we try to boil that information down into a one-stop shop package where somebody can go into OSVDB, run a search, pull up a software package, whether it be by a time date or by a specific classification, if it's a remote exploit or a web-based exploit, and try to figure out exactly what it is that they need to fix in their particular environment.
And if you actually wind up, this is something probably not a lot of people are aware of, if you actually wind up digging down into the source code to try and understand a particular vulnerability, sometimes you can't help but trip over 10 other vulnerabilities that are just staring you in the face as you're trying to look and diagnose one of those. So it's unfortunate, but at CVE we just don't have the resources to go and dig into all these others. So we have to kind of adopt a policy of enlightened disinterest, as it were, just so that we can get our jobs done.
And one of the other issues is classification, and I know you attempt to classify how serious a vulnerability might be, but it will mean different things to different people. So how do you just attempt to say how serious a vulnerability is?
CVE has a close relationship with the National Vulnerability Database, NVD. So we let them, or rather they are willingly generate CVSS scores based off of the CVE descriptions as well as other information sources. CVSS at least aims to be a fairly unified, consistent scoring mechanism. But for those who don't use CVSS, we have a rough set of terms of about 10 different terms: remote code execution, executing arbitrary commands. We have a few different flavors of denial of service. So we roughly break down consequences into around 10 different categories or so. That kind of thing is done by most other databases. And thinking about it from a sysadmin perspective, that's about as far as you can go.
John, as somebody who's receiving, as somebody who's receiving an audit from a third party, they might, and I know we've gone through this experience before, based on how serious a vulnerability is, I think you recall the rootkit that was on the Cisco router that was a serious vulnerability.
Right.
So how do you deal with these kinds of audit reports that say you've got a serious issue and you know it's not?
Well, it's the response that we write to the audit report to our senior management, classifying it as what we consider the real business risk. Because what the auditor is looking at is just what they think the technical vulnerability is. They don't really understand our business. And we have to translate what they're saying into how it affects our business so we can guide senior management on how to properly respond to these.
HD,
I just had a quick comment about a lot of times the folks who are doing the classification of vulnerabilities, either the Metasploit team who's taking public exploits and converting them to Metasploit modules, Kelly working at OSVDB, Steve working at Meyer working at CVE. Oftentimes the vulnerability classifier or vulnerability consumer sometimes ends up becoming the original source for the data as well. I mean, something we see a lot of times when Joshua Drake or Steve Tornio are looking through the Metasploit modules, they realize that, hey, this is a different vulnerability than one we've already have classified someplace else, and they, basically in the process of either figuring out a public exploit or classifying a public exploit, they end up coming up with a brand new vulnerability that they have to figure out what they're doing with. I mean, one of the challenges I see right now in the vulnerability management area is that the folks who are responsible for classifying, testing, and dealing with vulnerabilities often run into new bugs and have no easy way to really track those and make those public. And OSVDB does a great job of creating new entries when they find those, but understand Steve's point that they tend to be time constrained and they can't really dig into every possible bug of every application when they do find a vulnerability.
Let's move on to the next slide. This is an area that would involve Chris and John, basically. Vulnerability monitoring testing in the end user organization, and this is where you get various vulnerability scanners, other vulnerability software, your SIMs, your IDS, firewalls, logs, and basically how you're discovering vulnerabilities in the enterprise. So you could be discovering vulnerabilities that have been publicly released that are part of a vulnerability database, or these vulnerabilities could be in your configurations or your locally developed applications. Chris, did you have a few comments?
Sure. So, with the rise of web applications, we're seeing more and more organizations have a larger percentage of the code that they're running to that they have to run their business is custom code. It's either developed by their own internal development team or it's been outsourced and built. So you have a set of vulnerabilities that's unique to your organizations because it's in your applications that don't exist anywhere else. So that you in essence are the vendor in those cases, and you sort of have to do your own vulnerability management. Ideally, you would have discovered any vulnerabilities in the web applications during the SDLC, but that's obviously not typically the case. There are vulnerabilities that go into production, either because you didn't do enough security testing in the SDLC, your outsourcer didn't do it, or the application's just old. It might be a 10-year-old application, and you didn't have a notion of web scanners back then. So in those cases, you have to have a process of testing what's deployed, and then managing those vulnerabilities internally. So prioritizing them. I know we talked about it that's actually on the next slide, but the idea is now we're seeing a confluence kind of network scanners that are looking for vulnerabilities that are known and publicly disclosed, and they're starting to look at vulnerabilities that are in web applications too, and they're sort of coming together, both sources of vulnerabilities.
And John, your company, the point of the business is not to do vulnerability research, but do you find you're ending up in that business anyway?
Well, I am. So like Chris, I deal with two different kinds of vulnerabilities. I deal with the ones reported from vendors of applications or systems that I purchase, and then I have the ones from my own in-house applications. And actually, I can top you, Chris. I've got applications that are 35 years old running.
There might be some problems in there that you didn't discover.
We have hundreds of applications that our clients use that range anywhere from Web 2.0 going all the way back to IBM 360, 370 assembler that are still in production, still generating revenue. So I have a much bigger task of finding the right sets of tools to be able to test for vulnerabilities on a wide variety of platforms. And I go beyond just the vulnerability testing. I'm looking at how do I integrate tools and techniques going all the way back to, initial development, training of developers. It's a huge task. So
your way of discovering the vulnerabilities will be through the tools and also through your own research, but at some times, and not your organization necessarily, but others where I've worked, you get to know about vulnerabilities from an external source, say mail from a hacker who's saying, hey, I found this hole in your software, and that's something that you have to deal with sometimes. As Bloomberg found out. You worked on that case.
And the bigger challenge I have is that I've got applications that it's a diminishing pool of people who actually remember even how to code in those languages. How do I look for vulnerabilities in some of those very, very old apps?
Okay. Let's move on since we're running out of time. Remediation, it sounds like it's an easy thing. Organizations issue a patch, and isn't it simple, John? You just patch your systems and you're good, right?
No, it doesn't quite work that way. So if I look at, again, two different types of vulnerability management. On the vendor side, I look at what a vendor provides us. We have to look at deploying the patch within a test environment, testing all of our applications to make sure nothing is broken, looking at how the vulnerability impacts us to determine, do I patch my production machines first, or do I patch my desktops first, or do I patch my non-production servers? I have to look at what's the vulnerability, where's the impact the greatest to plan my attack. I had actually one vulnerability. It seemed rather innocuous, but it took almost a year to roll it out because it impacted so many different platforms and so many different people and a bunch of different customers. So some vulnerabilities can go out or vulnerability patches can go out very quickly. Others take months to actually get rolled out completely into production.
So my colleague Paul Asadorian in his blog post has brought up the issue of prioritization. Do you only patch for the critical vulnerabilities? Do you ignore the low ones? And Kelly, we were talking about this yesterday.
Yeah, it gets to be a little bit confusing sometimes. And as Carole mentioned, Paul's blog post said, the previous train of thought was that you would go after your critical vulnerabilities first and then go after your high ones, and by the time that you got into another patch cycle, you'd be focusing on another critical set and another high set. So when do you ever find the time to patch or upgrade on your medium and low ones? Doing it as we've seen now with Patch Tuesday coming out on the second Tuesday of every month, with Oracle moving to a quarterly patch cycle, with Adobe looking like they're probably going to be doing something along the same thing. You can go ahead and patch the critical and the high ones first, but then you've still got the medium and lows that you have to sneak in here and there, and it's not necessarily just in your production environment, it's in your test environment, it might even be in your development environment, and it gets really difficult to manage not only those vulnerabilities, but all of the information and all of the references and all the classifications and the disclosure dates surrounding all of those. So from a database standpoint, we can't really be biased towards only working on getting the information out there for the critical and the high ones. We try to prioritize them, like Steve had mentioned earlier. You sort of have to decide what's important to you and how soon you want to address a particular vulnerability. At some point, they all need to be covered, though. So we try to get the information out there for the medium ones, for the low ones, the ones for the software package that nobody has heard about since 2004, and it pretty much went into remission because nobody wanted to work on the project. If we see that vulnerability come out, we'll still get the information out there, but we do realize that we need to get the bigger vendors out there first. Again, addressing it back to our target audience, the people who are patching the systems, whether they're system administrators, security analysts, or system engineers.
Yeah, you mentioned the quarterly patch updates, and I think there's a few companies going to that model, and our colleague Brian Martin had mentioned that he foresees a perfect storm situation arising where all of a sudden lots of different vendors have a ton of patches on Patch Tuesday.
Yeah, where Patch Tuesday, Microsoft releases 20, and then Oracle's quarterly falls on that, and then Adobe's quarterly falls on that. So what used to be you could stagger out, say, 20 vulnerabilities a week that you could spread out amongst your team. All of a sudden you get 200 dropped onto like a bomb, and trying to prioritize all of those and getting them spread out again across your team can be a pretty daunting task from the vulnerability management standpoint, but from the information management standpoint, it's the same thing, where it's nice to have a really evenly distributed workflow across a month or a quarter. Sometimes you go into that queue of all the new vulnerabilities that have been released, and what you expected to see 20 is now 150. It can be quite a daunting task sometimes.
John, you had a comment?
Yeah, and actually, in looking at these slides, I couldn't think of anything I wanted to add, but I can add one here to remediation, and that's around resources. You know, my IT staff is X, but the vulnerabilities I get are Y, and there just simply isn't enough hours in the day or days in the week to patch everything. Otherwise, the staff would be doing nothing but patching systems. And so when we look at, what we decide to patch, we look at, if we don't patch something, what's the risk to the business, and do we consider that an acceptable risk? So we will find occasions where we will simply make a conscious decision not to apply a particular patch or set of patches because we think it's within an acceptable risk for the business. Otherwise, the IT staff just gets paralyzed by doing nothing but patching, and the rest of the business, which is supposed to be making money, gets ignored.
Any other thoughts on that? John, will you have the last one? Yay. Okay, you did good on time. So we'd just like to open up to if anybody's got any questions for anybody on the panel. Paul.
Let's get
I'm
this
sorry.
woman over here who raised her hand.
I'm sorry.
In the middle.
Sorry. The quiet mic.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'll go with the first in, first out question. Steve, you said that vendors make money on software and expect researchers to do it for free. Have you come across a vendor that has that expectation of researchers? Because when I look at the ecosystem over the last 5 or 6 years, there are so many more opportunities to get paid legitimately, not just VDI, but jobs, like not just doing this as a hobby in your free time. So jobs at vendors, jobs at consulting firms, do you really feel that vendors expect researchers to do it for free?
I may have misspoken a little bit. However, the number of vendors that have bug bounty programs, which is basically the vendors, paying researchers who are reporting things to them, that, there's like just a handful of vendors that do that. There's a general attitude. It may have changed a little bit, and there are certainly more opportunities for researchers to go professional. But there's generally been an attitude amongst a lot of different parties. I didn't necessarily mean to single out vendors, that, for whatever reason, the expectation is that researchers should be doing this for the good of the community, and thus it's a good deed, and shouldn't expect much more than credit, and there's something bad about them if they want something more than credit.
No, they should be playing World of Warcraft. We should probably talk later because I think you and I actually work in the same field quite a lot.
Actually, this just brought up a point I just wanted to make. If there's any reporters writing anything on this and you want to quote somebody, please check with them first to make sure they can be quoted and to make sure they didn't inadvertently misspeak or something like that, because we don't want to get people in trouble with their organization. So, Paul, you have a question.
Each week I read a lot of the descriptions for each of the vulnerabilities that are coming out every week. And it seems that there's a fair number of them that, well, I won't say completely useless, but they're pretty close to completely useless. They tell me there's a problem, and that's all they're really telling me. They're not giving me details, and I don't think that helps a lot of organizations that are trying to make a risk-based decision about what to do about that vulnerability. Hey, there's a vulnerability in this product. Here, you should apply this magic fix, and everything will be okay. So what can we do to push vendors to publish more information about vulnerabilities that are usually disclosed internally within that vendor? Or should we? Or will they?
What we found so far is a lot of vendors, and I'll name one for example, HP is really, really bad about having information in their advisories. They'll say, there's a problem in X, go find it. And because of that, you can see the number of vulnerabilities people are digging into. You look at the focus on the vendors who do that, it's products, and you see the number of vulnerabilities people are finding. Basically what happened was HP actually threatened legal action against someone about 7 years ago for vulnerability disclosure. That set off a whole tidal wave of responses of people focusing on HP products, excuse me, finding vulnerabilities. So what you've seen since then is because the vendor's been acting in that manner, most of the time that you find a vulnerability in an HP product, you see it ending up on full disclosure the next day. Look at all the operations manager vulnerabilities that come out. Every single downloadable product from HP has been ripped 20 ways from Sunday over the last 5 or 6 years because of the way they've been treating the research community and the way they've been holding back information from their advisories. So I'd say the problem's going to fix itself. The customers are going to be upset that the only way they find out about information is when it shows up with Metasploit, and the vendor's not doing enough to educate their customers about it. Eventually, it's going to solve itself. The vendor's either going to get called out by their customers saying you're not giving me enough information, or the researchers will just keep pushing so many vulnerabilities out there that the vendor's advisories will no longer matter. They're not going to be the source of information anymore. The actual researchers will.
I think we can get in one more question, and then we'll just have to catch us all in the hallways, because I think we're short on time. Who's keeping time here? Nobody. Okay. Anybody? Oh. Any other questions? Yes.
So I have a comment and a question on patch Tuesdays and quarterly releases of patches. So as a vendor who releases security vulnerabilities when issues come out, having them on a quarterly or monthly basis makes it easier to plan resources and release them and make sure that there's quality built into that release. I hear what you're saying about it increases the number of issues that you have to deal with at any one time. Do you see that this is a trend that's going to continue? More people are moving towards a quarterly release or monthly release schedule?
I think it is a trend. Patch Tuesday, again, is a monthly event, and with the coming out on a quarterly or a monthly or at least a scheduled, I do see that vendors would probably want to plan their resources more accordingly to that. It would be really nasty if all of the major vendors decided that they would now start releasing all of their patches and advisories on a specific day of a specific month or a specific quarter. From an information management standpoint, we would like to see a little bit more distribution, but that's just because we're being selfish. The vendors need to do what they need to do to protect their customers. If the information all hits on one day or 1 week, we'll deal with it as we need to. It might backlog us a little bit to get the information out to the people who rely on the service that we provide, but that is entirely up to the vendor, and I do see the trend going that way, but that's something that we'll deal with if and when it ever comes down to that perfect storm.
And what we'd like to see is if they're going to do this, if they're all going to, optimize for themselves, will make it easier for their customers to deal with that information. And so making sure you get a CVE, making sure you assign CVSS scores, make sure you have oval definitions so your customers can automate and bring some scale to their handling of what you just dumped on them.
I think we're definitely out of time here, and I'd like to thank everybody on the panel for coming together on this and trying to get through a very tough subject in a very short amount of time. If you have any questions, our email addresses are up there. You can send it individually or find us around the conference. Thanks very much for attending. Appreciate it.